speaker, CEO Kristan Straub from Wyloo. Kristan has more than 25 years of experience in the mining industry, having held various positions globally in mineral exploration, operations, and management. Most recently, he served as a member of Glencore Nickel's executive team as Vice President of Exploration. Following his role as President of Koniambo Nickel, SAS, New Caledonia. As Vice President of Glencore's Raglan mine in Nunavik from 2014 to 2018, he worked as a member of the Raglan Committee and also served on the Executive Committee of the Board of Directors for the Mining Association of Canada. Kristan is a proud band member of the Henvey Inlet and French River No. 13. He also holds a Bachelor of Science in Geology from Laurentian University. And we're so thrilled to have you here today, Kristan. Please come and tell us all about the Wyloo operation.
Thank you very much, John, for the warm welcome and the warm reception, and thank you very much for all of you to be out here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today and have an opportunity to discuss about what our future plans are in the Ring of Fire region for the development of the Eagle's Nest project. A little bit about our path forward and what we see to getting through to production, as well as to start off and have a discussion about who Wyloo is. I think many of you in the room probably knew very well who Noront was for quite some period of time, and although it has been, we're getting close to 2 years now, Ryan, in terms of the Wyloo purchase of Noront. I believe this is the first opportunity, my first opportunity to get up and have an opportunity to have a discussion with the Thunder Bay community. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming out today, and hopefully you'll find the discussion today enlightening. A little bit about the confidentiality and disclaimer piece. I think it's a fairly standard piece, but just to ensure that what we have here, what we're discussing today, while the material and the information is not confidential, the warranties behind it, as well as the other things, they're all subject to change until we get ourselves into a project that has a defined path forward. So who is Wyloo, and where are we? When I first took this role as CEO of Ring of Fire Metals, and Ring of Fire Metals was the new company that was brought out and put into place following Noront. Subsequent to that, our Australian ownership team made another on-market takeover and bid for a company called Mincor Resources in Australia. We were successful in acquiring that company and then folded both companies into the same overlying company called Wyloo at that point in time. So we're a nickel producer of scale. We're currently producing roughly about 10,000 tons of nickel per year. As many of you may very well be aware, the nickel market is in a challenging space today, with nickel prices falling off about 40-45% over the last year. So we recently announced that we're going to suspend our operations in order to not waste that resource that will be valuable into the future. So while we've made some changes there, we're continuing to be an operation that produces nickel, as well as an operation that is looking to develop Canada's, what we believe is Canada's best opportunity for a new nickel sulfide deposit and bring that into production here in Canada. As you can see throughout here, you have a photo of the Eagle's Nest deposit area down in the bottom, but you'll also see a couple of our different areas in Western Australia where we have operations. Importantly, through our Australian partners, we are working to develop a battery metals facility, processing facility, in an area called Kwinana, where BHP have their refinery as well. That is based on the ore and the nickel in concentrate that's produced out of our existing Australian operations, and we'll treat and process that in a joint venture with another Australian firm called IGO in that. Now, why is that important to us? Because for the Wyloo Canada group, we look to take the same path forward into developing here in Canada. So developing a business that's centered around building a nickel mine, creating some concentrate, transporting that concentrate, and keeping that concentrate here in Canada, and using that opportunity to create the next level of investment in Canada to ultimately build a battery metals processing facility here in Canada as well, that would be integrated into the electric vehicle supply chain that is growing here in North America. So that is a bit of the background on us, a bit of what Eagle's Nest project looks like and where we're at today and where we're going forward into the Eagle's Nest project. A very important part of our process, and one of the things that we stand to distinguish ourselves and differentiate ourselves from other mining companies today, is our approach to development. It first starts with people, and that is ensuring that we have genuine partnerships with the local First Nation communities, buy-in with the First Nation communities, their support, and they have an understanding of what partnership means. We're looking to do business in a different way than business has historically been completed and done in Canada. Canada has been well known as a leader and in the forefront for impact benefits agreements, and what we're looking to put into place here is at a different level from that. It's not just a conventional impact benefits agreement, it's a partnership agreement that I'll talk a little bit about into the future, that not only includes what would be considered part of an impact benefits agreement, but also the commitments around contracting and the commitments around the spend that's associated with mining operations. And I think historically, if we look back as an industry, it's an area where it has not been very open to First Nations previously, and that's something that we're looking to spur and carry forward and create something that's very different. When we get to the point where we have people, and we have people on side, then we're now looking at environment. So what does the planet benefit out of our project? Where do we get on that? Where do we stand in terms of environmental social governance and our performance on it? I'll talk a little bit about our plans for tailings. We've listened to the feedback from the communities about not having impacts on watersheds, not having impacts on surfaces. So we'll talk about the size and the dimension of what the operation looks like, where tailings will be stored, and our objectives for processing water and not having ongoing processed water discharge in our operation. And the last part is the project. Where do we meet and where do we see the global benefit for the project of Eagle's Nest in the Ring of Fire region? How do we see this project going forward, and what can we leverage off of our project? A bit about the foundation behind Wyloo, where Wyloo comes from. If you haven't followed who Wyloo is a group that was founded by Dr. Andrew Forrest and Nicola Forrest as a family group. They founded a company called Fortescue Metals Group, and that is the world's 4th largest iron ore company. They are, I don't want to say majority shareholders, they have a very large shareholding in that company, to which they receive their dividends and their benefits out of it. They've chosen to take their dividends and benefits and reinvest it into the future. Many of the investments that both Dr. Forrest and Nicola contribute are towards the decarbonization of our planet and towards the initiatives that would ultimately build the new economies around that. There's a very important part of that work is the work that's in Wyloo about developing nickel projects, about developing nickel that would feed into battery electric vehicles. But there are also things like Squadron Energy, which is Australia's largest renewable energy producer. There's also things like something called Sun Cable, which connects renewable energy producers to a new distribution network across Australia to get renewables into communities. So many of the things that we hear in Canada and North America that are difficult issues or restrictive issues for getting renewables in, this group is investing in breaking down those barriers and creating new environments for them to be successful within here. In addition to this, they also have a number of other investments that are quite Australia-centered in their applications. So things like clothing, retail, property. So they're very much focused on investing within Australia. Wyloo represents a new initiative that is focused outside of Australia, but also inside of Australia for the nickel production. The other piece that I'll talk about that is a very important piece is their commitment on their wealth to invest in philanthropic items, and that is through the Tatarang Foundation. So there's a large philanthropic association that they have invested in that carries on many of the other pieces of work that are non-industry focused in this particular region. And they have the largest philanthropic organization within the Southern Hemisphere. So why is that important? It gives us an opportunity to work at a scale and a level as a small project here in Canada, but a very important project with very good financial backing, irrespective of the period of time that we sit in the market. That doesn't mean that cash is flowing freely all the time. It just gives us the backing that the junior company at Norwalk didn't have at one point in time, and now we have a different level of backing and commitment for the development of the future-facing metals and a commitment to develop the downstream opportunities that Canada has at its disposal. There we go. Eagle's Nest. So a bit of a location for Ontario. I'm sure many of you know where it is. Right now, it's about 500 kilometers north of northeast of Thunder Bay. It's about an hour-long flight to get up into one of the communities and a quick ride across, or in the wintertime, a flight into the ice strip that's at site. And I believe we just started it up this week. Did we not, Mike? Yeah, that's good. But ultimately, it's going to require some infrastructure connection, ultimately, to be able to get concentrate out and get supplies into the area. So we're working closely with the communities of Martin Falls and Webequie First Nation on that. And as I'm certain that you're all aware of, both Martin Falls and Webequie First Nations are the proponents for the environmental assessment for the all-season roads into the area. There was a period of time where Noront was the proponent for those roads, and Noront, ourselves now being Wyloo, we're no longer the proponent for that, so we're reliant in a partnership with the First Nations to be able to garner access. Both of the First Nations of Webequie and Martin Falls have come together to form the proponency for the joint section that would be the Northern Road Link. Ultimately, the link of the road, the all-season road that would pass through the area that would provide access to Eagle's Nest. So, with those partnerships, we continue to work going forward, knowing that the area is remote, region, difficult access. It's a major challenge for us as we look to produce nickel that will ultimately be in a battery electric vehicle space. So one of the outsets and objectives that we have is to be a net zero operation in terms of carbon emissions, and quite possibly look at being a net negative carbon producer at a point in time. And that'll ultimately depend on some of the work that we'll do going forward in our feasibility study that's coming up in the next year. Why is that important? Because the distances of transport that are there and the remoteness of our operation. We must look at unique solutions to be able to create that environment where we're not producing nickel that is now consuming carbon and emitting carbon into the future, where you want to have a battery in a vehicle that's offsetting a petroleum or internal combustion engine. Now, many producers out there will talk about, well, it's a net lower emissions, so it's a net benefit for the economy. That might very well be true, but that doesn't stop us from having very high objectives of being a net zero producer and being a leader in this particular environment. What does the deposit look like? On the left-hand side, you'll see a color-coded, almost like a heat diagram of nickel content within the Eagle's Nest ore body. I would point out that surface is up on the top, and down at the bottom is about 1.5 kilometers, so about a mile deep. We have relatively good knowledge, above 750 meters, in terms of the deposit definition, and lower quality of information below. And that's just simply because of the depth of drilling that we're doing and the size and the dimension of the deposit. As you can see, it's a long pencil-shaped style deposit, which makes it amicable for vertical mining, but it makes it difficult to drill from surface and have a really good quality understanding of what that mineral information looks like down below. In the center picture, what you'll see in through here is in this section here is the ore body. This is the superficial area of the footprint of what the operation would look like, with concentrator, process buildings, as well as a camp that's located off the area in through here, a decline for a portal to be able to get equipment down and the material and supplies down, as well as the ore out from underground. All of these long, slender shape, we had rigatoni today, but these spaghetti-looking shapes that are down here, those would be all of the underground tunnels and accesses used to access both the ore zone. What is novel in the approach that we're proposing in through here is this particular area in through here. You'll see the orange cylindrical shapes in there. We have, in the geology of the area, we have granitic rocks that are immediately adjacent to the deposit. And granitic rocks are typically rocks that are non-emitting, non-acid generating. They don't have any contaminants associated with them. And so what we've looked at is, extracting these rocks to be able to use the material for the sufficient infrastructure in through here, because aggregate is in limited supply within the region. Use it for potentially some of the road access area and potentially some of the airport access area. So we would extract the granitic rocks from underground, much like you see when you're driving along the Trans-Canada Highway and you notice this great big cutout on the side of the road. You go like, what do they mine all that material for? Well, they mine that aggregate in order to fill in somewhere else to be able to provide the road. We would look at something very similar. It provides us with a unique opportunity to then use this void space here to take the tailings that are produced, so the ground up material that's produced, and put that back underground, much like many other operations do from a ground control perspective, to put cemented rock fill back underground. Now, we will use cemented fill within the area of the ore deposit because it needs to have some structural soundness to it to be able to mine up against it. During the feasibility study, we'll try and understand whether or not we need to use cemented fill in these particular areas and finalize that design. Suffice to say, in accomplishing this, we will be able to put all of our tailings back underground and not have any legacy tailings storage facility, which is one of the main concerns from an environmental hazard perspective at surface. Those hazards are addressed currently in mining by putting them in lakes or putting them in submersive dams or capping them so that there's no interaction with surficial water or air in the particular area. What does we look like from a life of asset? The deposit, as it's known today, has roughly about a 20-year mine life. 11 of those years come from the upper section in through here, from what we know, and the remainder 8-9 years down from the lower section, of course, which we have a lower degree of confidence around that area. In terms of average production, we look to produce about 15,000 tons of nickel on an annual basis in the form of concentrate. And in terms of value from the production, about 50% of our value will come from nickel and concentrate, about 25% to 30% in the copper that's in a separate concentrate, and the balance of the value would come from the platinum group elements in through here. You can see some other amounts that we would produce, roughly about 70,000 ounces of palladium, 20,000 ounces of platinum. They might be small in comparison to what Lac des Îles produces today currently, or some of the other operations, but it does make for a very good quality concentrate in terms of our production, and it's a high value concentrate in the market. On to the people selection. So, whether many of you know or not, we have memorandums of understanding signed for the current phase of work that we're in today, which is the exploration and the project development phase with the communities of Wyloo and the communities of Martin Falls. As we progress into development, environmental assessment, and permitting, we'll look to expand those agreements into partnership agreements. And that's part of the work that we're focused on today, is coming to an agreement with those two particular First Nations and outreaching to other First Nations in the region. I don't think it would be a surprise for anybody here to know that there has been some conflictual statements within the region about individual First Nations and other First Nations on their views and their approach to development within the region and their approach to either the development of the road and or mines. And that's something we'll continue to work towards. We've had a long-standing outreach to many of the other First Nations in the region to enter into a discussion at a point in time just to establish a relationship and create some form of understanding between. But today we continue with Martin Falls and Wyloo, and in hopes of having other First Nations along as well. When we look at the people section on what our intentions to develop, and as I indicated earlier, it's more than just a traditional impact benefits agreement that Canada has long been known for. It's a step above and well beyond what has conceptually been there and been there in practice in the past. So our current employment is about 50% Indigenous employment at site. Again, we would look to maintain very high levels of Indigenous employment and engagement at both our site and our other offices around. I would, again, look out and beyond. When I look at our executive management team here in Canada, I'd be hard-pressed to find other mining companies that have 2 Indigenous individuals on the senior leadership in many of those other companies. Again, standing out in the forefront, coming in with a very different perception and a different lived experience on how to both engage, but also develop going forward and have that understanding of what types of discussions must be had and how to lead through those areas. On training and employment, we're looking to create and sustain Indigenous employment opportunities. Now, that's a very large and broad statement, but we are looking to invest and co-develop training centers alongside with the Indigenous groups here to be able to train the necessary people that we have and ensure that we have the training programs that are there and required to sustain into 20 years. Having 10 years of operational experience in the environment of Raglan, I recognize and understand the number of new trainees that came into our organization just simply to maintain the ongoing flow of employees as businesses have, and many of you business leaders would understand what turnover is and how often you have to replace employees. For us, replacing employees means training new individuals coming in and new First Nations individuals to be able to come in to continue to participate in the business. We've stood out and indicated that we will guarantee better than $100 million in contracts. That is a first dollar sign that's up in that and the first piece of the award. We can look to the demonstrated history through Fortescue Metals, which created at a different scale, I might add, but when they created their iron ore business, Dr. Forrest committed to $1 billion in contract awards. Now, better than 15, 20 years, onwards, they have now awarded more than $4 billion in contracts to Aboriginal owned companies in Australia. So they've more than quadrupled what their initial commitment was at that point in time. We look to be inspired by the same sorts of things, but not just be inspired, establish the same conditions for success here that has made that business successful in Australia. And the last part would be around the social benefits, around the economic development for the region. That's of course something that in our partnership agreements we do recognize that we're operating within Martin Falls and Wyloo First Nations traditional areas, and that the social benefits and the economic development benefits need to also be accrued within that area. Great picture of Glenn up here. Geez, Glenn, I didn't know you were going to wear the same sweater today, or I would have changed it. I told you about the sweater.
That's all I have.
So late last year, Glenn led a very successful, in my view, first of its kind, Indigenous business workshop. And it was a discussion around what are the businesses and how can we engage with First Nations today and understanding what businesses need to be developed. And I see some cementation shirts in the room. You know, we had cementation presented at this workshop on how to partner on training, how to partner on development, and how to actually build out subsidiary businesses that are a benefit to the First Nations, that provide access to training and as well as access to the contract aspect. We also did have a couple of discussions led by other First Nations-led businesses. Dr. Ted Moses from Senecat had given our keynote and opening speech, which was that's the organization for the Cree Nation that has formed a business and economic development partnership in the James Bay Northern Quebec Accord that was founded off of the development of hydroelectric dams, but now also plays a significant role in the development for mining and industry within that region. And lastly, and Glenn, I know I'll have skipped a couple of other ones, but we also spoke to Athabasca Development Corp, which again is an economic development corp formed out of multiple First Nation groups within the Athabasca Basin area, and they're the groups that are responsible for contracting in many of the ongoing operations within the Athabasca environment. So we are aiming to bring together other successful examples of where First Nation business ventures, First Nation-led business ventures are successful in the Canadian mining industry, and start from this perspective. Not build it onwards and afterwards as an afterthought, but start the design today in understanding what businesses, what development, and what training can be brought in so that our First Nations partners participate from the project planning, the development, as well as the execution stage and phase. So, and as we said at the bottom here, to build the capacity to create a renewable economic resource. We recognize that mining is a finite and a non-renewable resource, but if we can work together to partner and create capacity and create economic benefit and value, that economic benefit and value can then continue to reinvest in areas that are outside of the non-renewable resource space and generate renewable revenues for the partners in the future. On the sustainability side, what you'll see in this particular picture here is, this is an aerial photograph of the Eagle's Nest area. Sorry if I have to step away. We're looking to develop within 1 square kilometer through here, and you'll see the earlier photo was just a close-up of this area in here, but we're looking to develop what would be in this white outline shape, and that will of course be refined by our feasibility study. It's already changing today, but this is the area that we'll look to work within. As you can see, all of the high reflectance areas, all of these white areas in here, are all areas where the existing camp and there is existing disturbance. So in terms of level of disturbance, that disturbance is not going to change significantly between what we have there today and what would it look like in the future in terms of scale of area. Of course, the buildings and the construction materials, they will all change. There'll be concrete, there'll be steel, all of those other things today where there are tents and plywood. But in terms of footprint, it's all largely the same footprint of the area. I think, as I've mentioned before, in terms of the things that we're committed to not do, which is no surface tailings, no surface quarries, open pits, or waste rock piles left at surface. That doesn't generate all of the emissions pieces that many other operations have to manage in terms of dust emissions, in terms of acid mine drainage, or acid rock drainage in the case of acid generating materials being stored at surface. If you don't generate it and don't bring it to surface, it's not something that has to be managed and concerned. And I know sometimes we get lots of questions back because the examples that you look at in our industry have these things at surface. So trying to explain to somebody and have them convinced that you're not going to do it when the examples today aren't there. I can imagine it was very difficult for the Wright brothers to say, hey, we're going to fly and we're going to get up there and you're not going to fall. But in these types of things, they're important for us to consider as design basis. Because for many of you, if you have an engineering background, the easiest way to avoid a hazard or a risk is to not have it at all. And that's the fundamental first principle that we take, is to ensure that that hazard is not there. And then afterwards, you can continue to have the monitoring programs to demonstrate to communities and demonstrate to regulators that you're not having that impact because you don't have a risk that's there at that point in time. So, and that's another key component of the work that we're doing to ensure that that communication is readily available for our partners and for the communities that are there. So, I would finish on saying that the majority of the mine area is built on uplands in through this area through here. So it's called the Esker Camp. It is built on high ground in the area. So it's not a muskeg or a peatland type area where the particular operation is or planned to be. And we're also partnering again in terms of what our environmental assessment would look like. Not doing that in isolation on our side, but again looking to partner with the First Nations on their spots for them to participate and lead and co-develop what that process would look like with us. I've spoken already about water usage and avoiding discharge of mine effluents. We're currently in a phase today where we're collecting all of the environmental baseline material. Previously under NORONT, we collected a fair bit, and we've restarted that last year to collect and be able to compare the two sets of data and ensure that we have the proper data when it comes time to formalizing what that environmental assessment will look like going forward. I know I spoke a little bit earlier on the underground mine tailings solution, and I've gone through this particular slide, but schematically what it would look like is we would extract roughly about 4 million tons of the rock. Outlined here is the black area. When that excavation is created, the material would then go back into the underground environment and replace that. So in our terms, we would create a void by mining the ore out of the ground, and then the products that are remaining after we concentrate the nickel and concentrate the copper, we take then the tailings products and put them back underground. This ensures that they're not exposed to water transmission, they're not exposed to oxygen. Those two things are the key elements that drive metal mobilization and acid generation in tailings. So not creating that hazard by putting them back in an underground environment ensures that they don't create a future liability like they are when they're at surface. And by future liability, you'd see many of the tailings ponds, the liability in the future is the monitoring and the ongoing water treatment in terms of environmental exposure. And Ontario is known for having very stringent regulations and very stringent parameters around the operation of tailing sites. Our role in the energy transition, and these are just a few slides on what and why Eagle's Nest is important, and I'll finish up on these particular ones, and why nickel is important in terms of the energy transition for building out what Canada and North America look like for a battery electric vehicle market. What we see in gray here across, and we have, I'll outline it, nickel produced within the globe on the left-hand side, and along the bottom of the axis is time, if you can't see that. This date out here is 2040, and we're out here in 2024. So we see what the rest of the world produces in gray, what Canada produces across through here, and if we back up to 10 years ago, Canada produced about 250 kilotons of nickel, 250,000 tons of nickel, largely through the operations of Glencore and Valley at that time. A small amount contributed out of Sherritt that produces nickel out of Cuban ore, or Cuban matte. What we see into the future is a declining percentage and a declining amount of Canadian nickel produced out of Canada. This information is based off of the information that we can garner from other producers like Glencore and Valley. It doesn't include other potential projects. So I know there's a number of other additional nickel projects in Canada that are on the boards. It doesn't include those, but it does include a forecast of Eagle's Nest. What's important is back in 2015, Canada had roughly about 11% of the global nickel supply, and into the future, we have around 1% of that. That is because of the growth of production of nickel in Indonesia. In Indonesia, nickel is produced through Chinese investment. The Chinese investors have produced in the early 2000s something called nickel pig iron, which is a crude form and a crude nickel alloy that goes into making stainless steel. They very quickly built out about 1 million tons of capacity in a short period of time, in about, I would say, 7 to 8 years. What we see today on the future is China via Indonesia building out about another 1 million tons of supply of nickel that will ultimately go into battery electric vehicles. One of the key challenges with that is the environmental and the social performance of companies that operate in Indonesia. Many of you may have heard in the last number of weeks of a furnace explosion in Indonesia that killed a number of individuals. We saw late last year a number of labor disruptions and a number of people ultimately being persecuted and losing their lives as a result of it. There are some serious challenges with that, with the production of nickel that come out of these environments, not to speak of the environmental destruction and damage that happens through strip mining in these environments. So one of the things that we constantly stick on to a point of is we know how to do things in Canada, to do it socially responsibly, to ensure that we have proper engagement with First Nations, and environmentally responsibly, and follow our process here within Canada. And we can do that and produce good quality, clean, critical minerals for the future of Canada and North America. In terms of what Canada looks like today, when you have a look across through here, we have an outline of really where the producers sat in the early teens to today, what it looks like going forward. These additional numbers in through here are all the commitments that both Glencore and Valley and others have made into the future about the brownfields projects that they're going to bring online and they're going to produce. As you can see through the graph, the additional new operations that come in, and we hear this sometimes from other leaders of there's new projects happening in Sudbury. There are new projects happening in Voisey's Bay about an extension of a mine. They only offset the production decline that they have today. That doesn't add to Canada's production, and it doesn't add to the security of new supply coming into Canada to a market where nickel is going to be in demand. Speaking of demand, when we look at what the demand curves look like, I won't get into all of the pieces down here, but suffice to say the colors, the dark color is the percentage of what stainless steel is consumed at, battery metals in through here, and others like specialty alloys or plating. If you've ever seen nickel plating on some of your silverware or other things like that, nickel is often used in a plating environment. What we forecast is a demand deficit of about 1.7 million tons per year. If you recall, a couple of slides ago, Canada only ever really produced in the last 20 years, or the last 10 years, pardon me, about 200,000 tons per year. So it's a massive deficit, and that's going to have to be filled by what? By either new projects or Indonesian nickel coming into North America. And that's the key investment thesis that we continue to speak to two political leaders and two other leaders globally to understand, do we want more Indonesian nickel coming into North America, or do we want to ensure that operating in good quality first world regulatory environments like Canada and Australia, where we have the environmental protections and the social protections in place, do we want to invest in these areas? And of course, I'm standing here today because we firmly believe that investing in Canada and Australia is the right place to invest to create that supply. And I will leave it on this particular last slide here and then open it up to if there's any questions from the crowds. But as we look at where the supply is today in 2022, about 145,000 tons, and the existing demand is fairly well matched in North America for both Canadian supply and the domestic supply that's in through here. If we begin to look at the investments for the electric vehicles and the battery production facilities that the Canadian government and the Ontario government have recently announced, but also that the Quebecan government has also initiated in Bécancour in Quebec, you will see that just to meet the supply for those new battery facilities will require 460,000 tons of nickel to be consumed or put into batteries in those environments. Now, it's certain that into the future, when that material is available from old batteries, there will be a certain circular piece that continues to run based on recycling. But the quantity of nickel that's required today doesn't exist on the market from a recycling perspective. So new deposits will ultimately have to be put into production. And we face a choice as Canada. Do we want to see Indonesian nickel come in with the environmental and the social elements around it? Or do we want to invest in Canadian and Australian nickel in other areas like Canada and Australia that can produce nickel at a first quality? So, and that's more than 3 times what our current production is here. So I will leave it with that today, and thank you very much for the time and your participation today and your attention. So.
Long-term employability strategy for this project and also the roads projects. And I know that you talked about the idea of funding sustainable economic opportunities in the communities. Can you tell me a little bit about what that might look like in terms of how that money is accessed? And then I have a second question too.
Sure.
Is the underground tailings or the underground tailings containment systems, is that a system that's been proven in other locations? Okay, thanks.
Although the second question is probably the easiest one to answer. Yes, it's in operation today, and it's used in underground mines in Canada, Australia, South Africa. It's used across the globe, and it's a safe method of utilizing the tailings. It has not been deployed in lieu of creating tailings storage facilities at surface because it's less expensive to not mine the void space and just simply use a lake at surface and cover it with water. But it is a well-known methodology that's been used for a number of decades now in underground operations.
Thanks. It's one of the questions we get asked a lot about what's going to happen with the tailings. So.
When it comes to the business development piece, there's a number of them, and I won't get all of them here today, but I'll start with a number of them. I would say one of the largest ones is power generation. So what we recognize on our side as groups that do mining is we'll stick to our knitting on the things where we're considered experts in. In areas like power generation, we can look at developing power generation corporations, and we would have a power purchase agreement. If you look at how renewables are deployed at many other operating mine sites today, having deployed 2 windmills at a previous place, they're out of a power purchase agreement. So you have a partner who comes in, either we underwrite the contract in terms of our willingness to pay for that electricity over the life of the asset. That enables the new joint venture to access a loan and access the materials for construction, and then they get a return on that over the life of the asset as it comes back. We can look at camp and catering. Those are other areas where in many other organizations, they're contracted services. And so the opportunity for an Indigenous joint venture is to work with an existing camp and catering group. And again, if there's a requirement on our part to underwrite the capital investment for those sorts of things, we're prepared to do those. We're prepared to go that route. If we look at logistics, the transportation, access to the roads is 350, 400 kilometers up, and that's from Makina. So if something's coming out of Thunder Bay, again, in my operating history before, we've written contracts with other contractors where they're able to go out, source the equipment via the tractors, the trailers, and the machinery that's required along with the maintenance infrastructure, and we underwrite that contract and then sign a life of mine contract with it. Now that requires open book negotiation with the partnership to be able to do that. We're not expecting a partner to come in and have a rolling 2 or 3 year contract and they don't have visibility as to whether or not they're going to have the contract for the life of the operation. There are many more. If I look at diamond drilling, we had a group from Athabasca Development Corp. They have developed a very successful diamond drilling group that started in Athabasca and is now being exported across multiple other areas of Canada. And diamond drilling, again, is a core function that gets accomplished in the underground mine on a regular basis. So there are many other. Aggregate is an easy one as well. For the material that we would bring up to surface, the crushing, the hauling, the placement of that material, either on surface. Whether that fits into the ongoing road maintenance strategy is another question. The largest cost of aggregate, and I see some other constructors in here, largest cost of aggregate is transportation behind it. So when you have to transport aggregate more than 10 kilometers, maybe even more than 20, depending on the size of the threshold, at that point in time, most other groups start to look at where can I get my next source of aggregate rather than driving it 21 to plus kilometers away. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Other questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
You spoke about a feasibility study that's going to be done in the next year or so.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be done internally or is it going to be tendered out?
So the feasibility study is a study that we will conduct internally ourselves, but it's a study that we will continue to exchange and share with our partners. Because the feasibility study would include what the plans are for the Indigenous business enterprises that are being conducted out of there, what would end up happening is we would create a study where we have an understanding of what we would have for cost expectation, and then be able to go out and say, these are the pieces that we've allocated in our business. So I can go out today and have a look at a camp operation for a similar sized mining operation that's remote, and I can plug some numbers in with a reasonable estimate to say, plus or minus 90% that's going to be the cost. And now I can go back and say to a business joint venture, this is what my expectations are for cost. How do we work together to build a business that ultimately meets this? So, and that's part of the purpose for the feasibility study for ourselves. And the feasibility study to be able to develop what ultimately comes of the business product, the business joint ventures outside of that afterwards. So one of the outcomes of the feasibility study would be what we call in our terms a work package. So you create a work package around power. You create a work package around aggregate development. You create a work package around camp services and infrastructure in each of those. And then that gives us the knowledge and understanding around the specifications for what we're expecting to develop a business around.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
What's the expected timeline for the road construction at this point? What are you hearing about when that project might move forward?
I'm going to look at some other guys that I saw at the last open house because we're not we consult with the First Nations in development. We follow the things that are on Buckway Supply Road, Martin Falls Community Access Road, Northern Road Link. So the dates for submissions of final environmental assessment are in the 26 to 28 range in those years. And then subsequent to that, they would go through the next phases of permitting and then ultimately construction in that period of time. And I guess the follow-up question that everybody asks us is, well, when are you looking to do this work? We're looking to start construction in 2027. recognizing that in that period of time, we don't have all-season road access. So we would look at, and this is based on the NORA work that we did in the previous feasibility, the winter road access routes that are going to be created to support service the construction of the roads can ultimately lead to us being able to mobilize and construct in the same period of time as the roads get constructed, and looking for the first linear connection with the south in and around the period of time where we would be ready for first commercial production in, say, 2030. All of that is, all of that is dependent upon the roads advancing and the roads being accepted at this point in time. So we don't presuppose that. The only thing we can do is continue to plan in the aspiration of being successful in that. Yes?
Hey, Rob Hamilton, North Ontario Workforce Planning Board. I have some questions regarding your planning for your feasibility study. Are you including in there anything about the creation of water treatment plants to address the water issues that exist in those communities? And also, are you in compliance with treaty terms surrounding resource extraction for Treaty 9?
So good questions on the resource for water. Today, through our discussions, we're not engaged in the provision of government services. The government is responsible for providing clean water and access to clean water within the communities. Now, through the process of negotiating a partnership agreement, what the communities do with the benefits that are accrued out of that and how they deploy those resources and those funds is ultimately up to the community. And we can work with the community to support those efforts in ways that they see fit, but that's really a community decision at that point in time. With respect to the treaty and obligations under the treaty, our dealings and our partnership with the First Nations, we honor what we have with the First Nations and their association with the treaty.
Charlotte, one more, if that's okay.
Yep.
I know we're pretty noisy over here.
That's okay.
Because we're really focused on the training side of this and
Mhm.
getting people ready, to actually capitalize on the employment opportunities. You had mentioned training centers. Can you tell me what that means, to Wyloo when they talk about training centers?
I certainly can. One of the things that FMG, Forestry Metals, was very successful with was establishing something called VTEC. It was Vocational Training and Education Center. And that was for training for Aboriginal people in Australia. And people that had gone through, and still today go through the VTEC training program, they're guaranteed a job on the outcome. And it's not just with us, it would be with our supply companies and our service contractors. So this is a model that is not, that I've not experienced in Canada before. I've experienced it where, as a business operator, we've trained and guaranteed people employment, but I have never worked in a model where we train and guarantee somebody employment in a contractor who works for us. So that will be also something that as we develop and go from development into production, that'll have to be incorporated into our future contracts for employment and employee sourcing for the contracts that we have. But again, because that road is already, and that path has already been developed, there's a pathway for us to follow through that. Now, what does that mean here? I know Matawa, and when we've had a couple of discussions with KCATs at different points in time, there are training structures that are already established. We would either look to either leverage those training structures, or if there was a need to create something that was individual and reflected the resources and the skills that we require, then we would of course invest in that to be able to build the training center that would ultimately lead to the employees working with us, either for us or for our contractors. And I think I'd like to add, from an experiential perspective, at a previous operation, when we trained employees, not every employee stays for 20 years. Some stay for 3, some stay for 5, some stay for 10. But when you go back to the community, and the loader operator was trained by a mining operation, and they're the ones that keep the airstrip clean, they understand what the frictional requirements are for aircraft to stop on the ground. They've come through an organization that's trained them. They're successful individuals back in their communities, whether they're welders at the municipal garage, they're maintaining municipal equipment, There's a tremendous number of spin-offs and benefits that come through that training, even though the individual doesn't necessarily always remain. Our operation is very likely to be a fly-in, fly-out operation for most people, and that's something that we recognize. Few employees will start work there and will retire from there. So there is a traditional amount of turnover, and if I look at a past experience, some of the initial people that were there for construction, there was always a small group of people that stayed because they absolutely enjoyed it. And the others that came through, they had a 5 to 7 year retention period of time that stayed with us, and then they moved on to other opportunities, be they in their communities or other operating environments.